We'll begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet today and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging.
Thank you for the opportunity to present something that I'm extraordinarily passionate about, again here at Biala. I was here some months ago for a full day session where we covered some of what I'm going to be talking about in less detail. We actually spent a full day on this. So just wondering how many people in the room here attended that session. Okay, so just a few of you. So there might be a little bit of repetition, but when you talk about empowerment, it's always enjoyable, I think, so I hope that this will be valuable as well. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, Sarah Gaskin, who is a PhD student, Professor David Kavanaugh from QUT, but particularly and absolutely acknowledge the Oolong House in Nowra team, led by Ivern Ardler, as well as Tanya Bloxham and Martin Billingham, who have really enabled a lot of our understanding about the potential of the growth and empowerment measure in alcohol and drug settings. So my plan here is to sort of give you the story of the GEM, or the Growth and Empowerment Measure, and comment on how it can assist in drug and alcohol settings, and give you some examples of some learnings that we've gained through its use. So before going any further, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting here, as well as where people are sitting in New South Wales and different parts of the country. And I always also acknowledge, when we think about that, about this over 65,000 years that Aboriginal people thrived on this continent, and that was through a very deep, intimate knowledge, both I think of the environment, but also about what we're talking about today, which is empowerment. So learning in Aboriginal settings is particularly valuable, I think, when we really want to understand depth of how we can live together in a way that helps us all thrive and achieve our potential. So when we think about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander definition of health, I never get tired of reviewing this definition, because it reminds us what it is that we all need to be in order to be healthy, what we need. And we think about not just the physical well-being of the individual, but the social, emotional, and cultural well-being of the whole community, in which each individual is able to achieve their full potential as a human being, thereby bringing about the total well-being of their community. And if I had to think about all the definitions of empowerment that I've ever seen, this is actually the best definition of empowerment that I can imagine. Okay? So we probably don't need to go even any further than this if we really want to know what it is in the ways that people live their lives that enable them to be healthy, and that is about being the best that they can be and also contributing to their community. But if we look in the literature and we look at the ways empowerment has been defined in the past, it's been defined as there are more definitions of empowerment in the literature than you can imagine. But generally they fall into three sort of categories. One is as an outcome, so gaining increased control and mastery, meaning that you're better able to deal with the forces that affect your life, and also have greater capacity to deal with the day-to-day challenges of life without being overwhelmed by them. And when we get overwhelmed by the challenges in our lives, we don't always make the right decisions. We make decisions because our emotions, our social, we're upset in many ways. We get out of balance, and we don't actually, sometimes we don't make those choices that are the best for ourselves and who we want to be. And as a process, so that's as an outcome, you gain that increased control and mastery, but it's also as a process, which means you're doing things, you're putting in place that underlying control and mastery, and living the life that's consistent with who you are, as a process to promote that for other people, or to share, or to create conditions that promote participation of people, organizations, and communities towards the goals of increased individual and community control. So by becoming empowered, you're also working for the empowerment of others as a social action process. But it also is a process within individuals. So you can move from being highly disempowered by the circumstances and the overwhelming past. You can start to understand that and understand that those processes the things that have impacted on you have actually affected the way you have lived your lives and the decisions you've made. And when you actually can separate who you are from those circumstances, it often allows for this growth of the individual to put in place ways of living that are more consistent with who you are. So the literature describes this in a different way, but working in Aboriginal spaces and having under Aboriginal leadership reminds you of this all the time. So an empowerment, as you can see from here, is a multi-level concept. Individuals gain empowerment, they become more effective in organizations because they're not bogged down, they're not as bogged down with those circumstances, and pushing together towards improving structures so that the policies and the practices can be better for everyone. And very important in terms of empowerment, it's often, if you ever think about what maybe leaders or politicians or things are doing, it's often good to think about, is this a power over situation or is this a power with situation? So empowerment is not about having power over. It's actually about having power with. And one of the things that's threatening about a power with idea is some people think that power is finite. So if I'm going to gain power, someone has to lose power. Or if someone is gaining power, then I start to go, uh-oh, my own power base becomes threatened. That's a power over situation, and that is not empowerment. Empowerment means when you share power, when you work together, and you can actually create more power because you're creating a better world for everyone. So empowerment implies that sharing power, which makes it actually limitless. Not a finite quantity, but we can create more power because our society is actually enabling more people to reach their full potential. So that's not always understood when we talk about empowerment. It can be threatening if it's taken the other way. And another thing about empowerment, because as people are sharing power, working together, and seeing gains throughout themselves, there's an implied positive direction. Where it's very values oriented and it's closely connected with people actually feeling better or gaining social and emotional well-being. They're feeling better within, they're having better relationships with others, and that well-being that improved well-being is a consequence of empowerment. So this is the way that I've come to understand empowerment through the experience working with Aboriginal people. And particularly, I want to highlight this one program which changes lives because people actually experience, they come from one place, they move and they come to another place where they are able to operationalize the things I've just said as theory. So the Family Wellbeing Program, how many of you heard about it? Okay, yeah. It was developed by Aboriginal people who were working in the Aboriginal Education Development Branch, the Office of Vocational Education and Training in South Australia. And this was in the 1990s, where there was really a push to try and get more gains on the ground. So Aboriginal people were experiencing gains politically with a lot of good things being put in place at the time. We were all very hopeful. But there was a recognition that people were still on the ground struggling from the impacts of the ways their lives were changed by European policies, invasion, etc. So it was the people who developed the program actually themselves had experienced severe consequences of the stolen generation. They'd been taken away or had families taken, family members taken away. So they understood that extreme disempowerment of that circumstance, but they actually were able, through life experience, to heal and actually become leaders such that they were designing programs and curriculum for the education department. So that space, that movement that they made, they realized as they were coming together to do their work that there were lots of very valuable messages from their life experience. They developed a program looking both within but also at some other methods and theories around, for example, finding mindfulness, that's the word I was looking for, or how to actually put yourself in a better space, learning those techniques as well, and develop the family well-being program. So some of the principles that you learn that are very strong learning components of doing the family well-being program is that even in the most desperate of situations, there is always something, even a tiny thing, that a person can actually do themselves to make things better. And there's actually some literature around in the emergency department, people actually having crises, to actually enable them the opportunity to not be completely controlled, to actually begin to have some control over the situation themselves. Some people argue that you shouldn't open up empowerment when the structures aren't empowering, etc., that it frustrates people, but that frustration is actually part of recognizing the need for change. Empowerment occurs when people can recognize and apply their own strengths and inner qualities in their choices. So gaining control, gaining understanding of emotions, and actually putting strengths in place rather than sort of reacting on anger and immediately responding with responses that make things actually worse. That change starts from within, that skills and little successes make change sustainable, because you actually gain that little bit of well-being as you're making small changes that eventually add up to large ones. And that empowered individuals can be supported to use this personal change within themselves as a basis for participating and leading organizational and community level change. So there is quite a large literature now, particularly led by Komla Che from James Cook University and others, who have actually put this program on the map in terms of community development, empowerment, community psychology, and to some extent in the mental health field. So I've kind of explained this in terms of empowerment from an Aboriginal perspective that we've learned, but this comes directly from Aboriginal people who did the family well-being program and really, again, from within themselves understood that healing and growth process. So people describe healing, empowerment as healing in terms of coming to terms with the present and past situations and actually dealing with the pain that they're carrying around, but utilizing that healing process to gain more control of the present, becoming strong both culturally and spiritually, remaining calm despite the turmoil around them. It doesn't go away, it's still there, but inside themselves remaining calm, finding their voice, becoming a participant in positive change, and working together for a strong community. And some quotations here I think coin that really well. So when one person said, when a person takes the first step towards becoming empowered, it is also the first step of healing. And it's about knowing who you are and where you belong. It's about being proud of who you are. And with empowerment, you are building people to have the power to stand up and make change. What you put into your inner self, it shows on the outer. So those definitions are quite different from what we see in the literature. And that's why I think this listening to Aboriginal people's experiences is particularly important in really gaining a deep insight of what empowerment is, as nothing is taken for granted in this setting. And this is a diagram that was developed by a First Nations Canadian, Dr. Arlene Lalibert, who was working with our team when I was up in Cairns, and looking at, she conducted a series of interviews with people from around Cape York about suicide and self-harm and how it happens and what the sort of meanings of it was for people, but also in how to get out of a situation where there are suicides happening in one's community. And she sort of summarized her work in terms of this dual circle, where when you have a situation where people are under high stress, they feel helpless and hopeless. The situation actually drives coping mechanisms, acting out, or alcohol, drugs, and violence, that response to that situation. And then suicide and self-harm is something that can result from a circumstance where that stress is so high, something happens and it may occur. But moving out of that, community members throughout the Cape recognize a different way, which actually enables that recognizing and building strengths, having people work together in positive collaboration, creating action, and then that enhancing that belonging and sense of self-worth that is protective against the stress and the helplessness and hopelessness of the other situation. So this is a transformation that family well-being actually helps people to make, because they can recognize their strengths, and then they get skills and knowledge about how to actually build them and live by them instead of the acting out responses. So I think this really coins very well that transition between a situation of great turmoil into a situation of positivity. And the story of Yarrabah, maybe many of you have heard, as to where such high suicide rates that were occurring in the 90s led the community to get together and start to really go into that positive action experience. And Yarrabah has led a lot of the work I'm talking about today. They've put it in practice, and suicides went away. That means people were thinking differently. They stopped thinking about the red side and moving to the green. Okay, so the question with the growth and empowerment measure had then was, how do we measure that? How do we know it's happening? How do we, if we're actually working in the field and outcomes are expected of you, how do you actually measure that process of change? So it's a bit daunting because empowerment is so complex, it's very different for every individual. So, and you want to be extraordinarily respectful because of that profoundness of the change we're talking about. You don't want to get it wrong. So the story of the gem is thinking about how do we measure the process, the impact, and the outcomes of empowering change. So why measure it? I'm standing in front of a group of clinicians. You know we live in an outcomes world. We've got to keep cranking out those outcomes. We've got to know what the impact is that we're having on our clients. So we actually need a really good measure that captures what it is that you're trying to do, that's happening between yourself, your service, the groups that you might be connecting your clients with, etc. You want to know that that change is in process. So lots of qualitative descriptions of empowerment were in the literature when we began, but there really was no measure that actually was able to capture these kinds of changes that I'm talking about. Those changes that help people move and achieve those better health outcomes on a long-term basis, because it's actually embedded in who they are and the life they're living. So pretty daunting as far as getting it right, that the tool had to capture the shared and valued change in levels of empowerment. So it can't just be what a group of academics or clinicians think empowerment is. It actually has to be deeply reflective of that experience that people were sharing. So we utilized qualitative data from family well-being participants because they'd stepped into a room, they stepped into a change experience deliberately, so they were quite aware of how that actually enabled them to change their lives and what was particularly valuable to them. And this was reflected in the interviews with family well-being participants about that experience. And the tool must reflect the cultural context and definition of empowerment for Aboriginal people. It was being developed within an Aboriginal setting and captured their own words and concepts highly respectfully. And the tool had to be strengths-based. So nothing's worse than having I can imagine having a great session with a client and then whacking them with a scale that made them go right back to where they were feeling when they walked in the door, right? So we actually wanted the instrument, or answering the gem, responding to it, to actually be part of the process that you're trying to help the person make. Okay? So promoting hope and guiding effort. So those were the three kind of requirements that we set out from the very beginning. And we underwent a iterative, back at a circular or continuously reflecting and ensuring we're getting it right, methodological process to develop the gem. So in defining, in the first place, what is it we're measuring? What is this pathway? How does it happen? And what are the important components? Starting with interviews and then analyzing them, finding themes. Had this huge blowout of 150 pages from 20 interviews about the different ways people experienced empowerment. But then through a synthesis, actually getting something that was kind of upstream and not specific to their own lives, but reflecting change in a way that they would recognize it in the instrument, trying to make it something that was broadly useful but also meaningful, not too abstract. So validation, confirmation workshops, we created a number of workshops with rural, remote, and small urban communities, and adopted a tree metaphor. Then we went on to trial the instrument. We had specialized workshops of experts to look, including health economists, as well as prominent Aboriginal leaders. We piloted, improved the instrument, and we've been using it ever since. So, and recently this year we conducted a confirmatory factor analysis, which kind of steps it up to another level of validation, with about 800, nearly 900 people, Aboriginal, non-Indigenous people, men, women, people in services, and people in communities, etc. And our factor structure, or the measure, actually passed in terms of, yes, it works, it's valid, more broadly than from our pilot study. Okay, and I love this picture. This is Lynn Dell, and I can't think of her. So anybody know Lynn Dell from Gindaja and Yarrabah?
Yeah.
What's her surname?
Thomas.
Thomas, that's it. Yes, sorry, Lynn Dell, if you ever watch this. She was very profound in the workshop because she, working in Gindaja, she identified this situation of healing. So she looked at some of, if I can't walk over there, but you see in 1 and 2 there, there's sort of those aspects of beginning to understand, recognize your strengths, value yourself, etc. Number 2 is about getting more stability in your life, so you're standing more firmly instead of bending with things that happen. And she said when people, I still remember, this was about 15 years ago, that when people come into drug and alcohol rehab, they're often in a hole for those 2 things. They have to actually work to get themselves out of those holes so they can start to see themselves as active participants in their lives. So she liked this initial sort of visualization of what we were hearing from the interviews, etc. in putting, we switched over to a tree metaphor, I'll show you in a minute. She really liked this one and made this poster. And it's very interesting, the things that she's written on it in terms of what empowerment is. But then through time, through the workshops, one Alice Springs, this participant who had done family well-being, said, you know, the circles are cute and everything, but really, come on, you're really talking about a tree, you're talking about multi-dimensional, multi-directional growth. And as soon as that was said, we went, yes, of course. Now this was before there's a lot of tree motifs now, in particularly representing social emotional well-being, but this was actually a beginning for us. And the person on the right here is Laurie, and I also, his surname is not with me, but he actually designed the graphics for this poster. And the person on the left is Lynn Riley, who's an amazing guy, if you've ever come across him. He actually developed the sort of visions inside the gem, as well as participating in all of its development. And Lyndon is currently doing his PhD on parenting up in Cape York. And then we had specialized workshops, and as we all know, Mick Gooda was the Social Justice Commissioner, took a very in-depth interest in the Growth and Empowerment Measure, and the CRC for Aboriginal Health, as well as the NHMRC, provided funding for its development. Now, I just want to also point out the person sitting there was Jeffrey, oh my gosh, he's a leading health economist, and he was very interested in how to measure these changes too. So in terms of having a measure that you can actually attribute value to. So his name will come to me. So we came up with this kind of diagram of what empowerment process is. And you notice it's in a circular fashion. Initially we thought that that sort of gaining understanding of self would be a first step. Becoming engaged in a change process, becoming self-aware, recognizing potential. The interview suggested stepping through the door of family well-being started that process for them, which then led them to be able to establish more personal stability, self-care, etc., then towards setting goals, working together, etc. But in the workshops, people said, you know, that's really not how it happened for me. I stepped in with a group, and by participating in organizational change, in making things better for their people, that actually gave them the ammunition to do the personal work. So that's why it's in a circular fashion, because people can step in wherever. But what happens in the center there, that empowerment process, is that wherever you do work around that circle, that grows. So if you're working with other people and it's empowering, your empowerment grows from that experience, which feeds into personal and the desire to work towards improving structures. So this is what we actually tried to capture through the growth and empowerment measure. Quite a complex process, multiple entries, different contexts, different challenges, but trying to get what it is that people were doing that enabled growth right around that circle. So the gem, this quotation captures it really well, that empowerment is like a tree. There's a foundation with seeds and roots, then the energy and self-esteem to look after yourself, having a strong trunk that doesn't get blown over in the wind, so you can grow. The more you grow, the bigger it gets on the branches of the tree, education, job opportunities. So if you think about it, if you get too many opportunities too quick, that trunk, when gum trees have too good of a situation, when they go overseas and get lots of rain, etc., they grow really fast, but really thin, and the first wind blows them over. So that context of really grounding yourself heavily, your roots, etc., and getting a strong trunk is required to enable, to support the kinds of opportunities that might come your way. And that's why we often talk about, in terms of change, you can either go by the stomach, you can give someone a job, but if their heart isn't well, then you're probably not going to have a good outcome for that. But if you work on the heart and the stomach at the same time, then the person is actually able to grow and make the most of the opportunities for themselves. And the kauri tree here, which you see, was actually identified not because of a location, but actually because it's one of the oldest living trees. It's been on the planet for since the Jurassic period, and it's a symbol of that enduring and that strength of Aboriginal culture being one of the oldest living cultures on the planet today. So it's actually symbolic of that enormous longevity and strength of Aboriginal culture. And people would say first, oh, we want this kind of tree, and that's fine. If people want to do that, that is absolutely fine, but the underlying purpose of the kauri was actually for that reason. It's also a beautiful tree, and it grows so strong and tall. Just by looking at kauri trees, it kind of gives you that inspiring feeling. So the growth and empowerment measure has 3 parts. So there's 12 scenarios. In its complete form, there's 12, which represent the process of empowerment. So that movement of people from one place to the next in terms of gaining more understanding of themselves and be able to create, live in their living situation more empowered ways. And then the Emotional Empowerment Scale, or the EES 14, aims to measure the impact. So that scale comes from interview codings when people were describing that they were showing or feeling the signs of empowerment. So the impact of the changes in the things they were actually doing in their lives or the process. And then we also can use the Kessler scale in the validation, and frequently use it because it has some validation with mental health. But any kind of outcomes can be put together with the other parts of the GEM, the scenarios and the EES, as outcomes of those changes. So if you're working in mental health in the Kessler or depression scale, etc., might be useful. If you're working in drug and alcohol, the IRIS or other measures that are more specifically tailored to what your service is trying to achieve, help people achieve, can also be used. So what does it look like? So it was a long process of actually designing how the GEM looks. There are 12 of these, which we call the 12 scenarios. And some people are a bit daunted by having 12. There's a short form of 6, which I'll tell you in a minute. But when you actually understand them, you realize they're easier than they look from the start. So this one is talking about, example, your relationships with other people. And you can see on the left it says, I feel completely trapped in my relationships, dealing with all sorts of things. It might be kids out of control, it might be anger and fighting, it might be gossiping or bullying, and most of my relationships are harmful, not healthy. So that is one point. Then there's movement towards the next one. I'm starting to gain an understanding of difficult relationships. I've started to think about how to make them better, and I'm thinking more about what I'm saying in my relationships, but I have a lot of work to do to improve. Up to the 3rd level, I'm making progress, I'm well on my way, I'm talking better, I'm listening, and I'm seeing improvements in the way people respond to me. And the last one, my life is now richer and happier because of the many good relationships giving me peace and harmony in my heart, and I'm actually being able to reflect that to others. So this goes from a point of having lots of problem with relationships that are holding person back to actually and having those relationships be one of the most wonderful things in their lives. And that concept is actually firmly embedded in the family well-being, especially the last stage, where we really look at every relationship as a gift, whether it's a good one that makes us feel really good and helps us grow directly, or bad ones that teach us things about ourselves that we probably need to learn. So there are 12, as I said, 12 of these, and they factor into 2 subscales, which we call Healing and Growth subscale and Meaning and Purpose subscale. So if you're delivering all 12, you can have these 2 subscales from the data. Healing and Growth, dealing with painful feelings. And this, as we've been using it, we're understanding more and more that's actually, we can actually coin as a healing scenario that reflects healing. Safety, obviously, absolutely critical. I can keep myself safe and my family. I can set boundaries, say no. I can engage with learning. I can speak out and be heard, improve relationships. I can react to judgment without taking on board or getting myself into fights and trouble. And in the meaning and purpose, able to make changes, develop spirituality. I'm recognizing it within myself, my identity, establishing and growing, valued in the workplace, and working for towards a better community. So These 2 subscales have just been confirmed through confirmatory factor analysis, but pushing from services saying this is too long, we don't have time for 12. We actually have done an analysis to identify 6 what we call core scenarios, which are most closely related to the impacts of empowerment in the emotional empowerment scale, or seem to be the greatest drivers of outcome changes for people. In the 6 core scenarios, the healing one, able to deal with emotional pain and move forward, creating safety for self and family, self-efficacy, having confidence in making change, identity, sense of knowing who you are, ability to speak out in the community, actually make some impact, and also understanding and improving relationships. So services have been quite interested in those 6 because of the less time that it takes. And what we're trying to do here is actually measure this kind of change from negative spaces that create a lot of emotional impacts, coming into a healing space and moving to a new place such that life is looking very different, potential, etc. And when people actually start to help other people, they kind of get an express lane up to that top, because they know other people are relying on them or seeing them, watching them as role models. And people have accounted as to how that actually was a thing that kept them on track of recovery. Okay, the other scale, emotional empowerment scale, there are 14 items, and they go across the scale like this. These are much quicker. People kind of like it because it doesn't take as much time, but in fact it's not quite so illuminating in terms of the person's situation for a clinician. These factor into 2 subscales: an inner peace one, skillful, full of energy, confident, centered, focused, relaxed, happy, secure, can deal with anger, and self-capacity, can speak, people listen, satisfied with opportunities, valued, admired, and feel hopeful for a better future. And then outcome measures, as I mentioned before, you can place anything together with these 2 and understand some of the underlying processes that enabled those outcomes to change for the person. Okay, so I'll just spend about 5 minutes, 10 minutes here just talking about some examples of the use of the GEM. And in the alcohol and drug setting, through a research project that was led by Anthony Shakeshoft, we were able to actually go out and deliver 5 stages of the family well-being to an alcohol and drug team. And they actually have subsequently gone and delivered the family well-being program quite extensively in their areas. So there was a small group, and 6 of that group completed the GEM 2 or 3 times. And if we look at their scores, we can see that the blue bars represent a change, well, where they were at when they began the program in terms of the 12 scenarios. And then the red being after stage 1, which is sort of a foundation of skills and understandings. But when they've completed stage 5, which is a facilitator training, we measured again to reflect the entire process, and we saw stage 1 helped a bit, but going through the entire program really made a profound change, especially in the healing subscale. And whereas you can see that purpose subscale a bit more stepwise. And even though this is only 6 people, these results are actually statistically significant in terms of completion of stage 5. So the GEM is exquisitely sensitive if people have experienced an empowering change. And we can also look at individual change within those 12 scenarios. And for example, we see that this group of people particularly felt an openness and a gain from education from stage 5, as well as so the green line there is this after stage 5. You can see identity is also another peak, a big change from before. Workplace, being respected in the workplace, as well as relationships. So we can also, the GEM lets us look inside the mechanisms of change, as well as just a difference in a total score. A couple of points I want to make. So I've spent a lot of time talking about family well-being process as underlying the development of the GEM, but what we found is it works, has excellent sensitivity to change, etc., in a range of empowerment processes. So doesn't have to be the family well-being, it can be any other kind of empowering experience that people have. So in terms of drug and alcohol settings, you don't have to actually do the family well-being to see these changes, because the things you're doing may be equally efficacious or be working very well. So it's generic in terms of what it can capture, and also it can also detect change in Indigenous as well as non-Indigenous people. We've had that. And where we've learned a whole lot about the GEM is actually in Oolong House in Nowra. And there's the former CEO, Ivern Ardler, who has been a champion in terms of capturing outcomes, in terms of creating a healing program at Oolong House. And I can't acknowledge him too much. He has just been a wonderful leader at Oolong House, and certainly for the use of the GEM. Has everybody heard of Oolong House in Nowra? Yeah, okay. So they have a 16-week program. It's men only, but it's about 60 to 70% Aboriginal participants and about 30 to 40 non-Indigenous. And they work closely with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal services down in Nowra with a focus on alcohol and drug and mental health. They have a lot of mental health comorbidity coming along, and men come from different places, from home, from court, or from jail. These are some of the aspects of their program. So these couple of slides came from a presentation that Ivern and I did with Quaif and Quisp at the ICE Roundtable a few years ago, where Ivern gave a very detailed and elegant description of the Oolong House program. And in their program, they have for about 9 years now been collecting data at entry, 8 and 16 weeks. They use parts of the side check, the brief treatment outcome measures, the Indigenous Risk Impact Screen, the IRIS, which actually works quite well with non-Indigenous men. By the way, I don't know if that's, but they use it with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and it's highly effective, as well as the GEM, the Drug Taking Confidence Questionnaire, and the Kessler 10. And sorry, that's not really clear, but this is data that comes from a publication by Stacey Berry and the original team that worked with Oolong House to bring the measures in. And this showed that the sensitivity to change, particularly from entry to 8 weeks, but also continuingly significant increases between 8 and 16 weeks. So it kind of validated the continued growth, that it doesn't all happen in the first 8 weeks, that there's continued growth over the second half of the program. And I'll just show you a quick result, which has been particularly interesting. So because they use the side check and some parts of the side check, and particularly question regarding suicide, question 5A, have you thought about ending your life? Has it been on your mind? And has it happened recently? This gives us a bit of insight into a group of people that are coming in a severe state, if those thoughts are recent. So about half had never have thoughts, 48%. About 36% ever, but not now. So it would have been sometime in their past. And about 16% reported having recent thoughts. And if we look at change over time in the Kessler, so this figure here, if you give me a second, on the left-hand side, it's the mean score for the Kessler 6 distress scale upon entry. So the circles are never, the squares are previously but not recently, and the triangles recently. We can see that people who previously but not now are actually significantly higher. So they did have a higher distress, but not nearly as high as those who had recent thoughts. And we see at 8 weeks a decline, a rapid decline, particularly for those who had recent thoughts. And also another subsequent decline from 8 to 16 weeks. But one of the interesting things here is if we look at the 16-week triangle and we go back to the 8-week circle, they're about the same level. So at 16 weeks, those who came in with those thoughts were still experiencing higher levels of distress than those who didn't. So it lets us see how people are traveling as well throughout the program. And if we look at these 6 sub-scenarios, those core 6 that I said that are really the critical 6, we can see the circles being never, the squares being ever but not now, and the triangles, we can see distinct differences when they walked in, improvements along the way, but again, if you look at the triangle at the second 8 weeks and work backwards, you can see they're about the same as the others at 8 weeks. Okay, so that's kind of a useful thing to do, saying there could be more work that could be done with that particular group. And obviously that would be a priority group. And this just explains what I just said. So the tools are sensitive to change. They can find sensitivities within different people coming in with different things in their backpack that they're having to work with, etc. And they can also indicate that change and perhaps the need for a bit more work over time. Okay, I'll just go quickly. I know Ed Heffernan spoke to you last week at the seminar. In that project, the family business, I assume I wanted to get here, but I wasn't able. Yes, he did, okay, yeah. So they also used the core 6, this wonderful team of Ed and particularly Kamina Anderson, who really took the lead in terms of adding the growth and empowerment measure to the different measures that they undertook as they were looking at aspects that were particularly linked to post-traumatic stress disorder among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in prison. So they were comparing women without PTSD, Aboriginal women without PTSD in prison, which is actually quite they probably have a pretty tough life, and comparing those with actually a diagnosis of PTSD based on the CIDI diagnosis. So looking at differences between these two groups. And we can learn about empowerment, I think, if we look at the findings that they have from the growth and empowerment measures. So if you find that report, it's online, and go to page 63, you'll see the different scenarios of the 6, dealing with painful feelings, safety, make change, sense of knowing who you are, able to speak out and be heard, and relationships with other people. If you see from here, the mean score between those with and without, those with PTSD had a much lower GEM score, 24.6, compared to those who were under serious circumstances, but without that extra burden on them. And this, I've graphed these just to look at the differences in the some of those scenarios. And scenario number 1, which is about dealing with painful feelings in the past, had an enormous difference between those with and without PTSD. So in some ways that's probably confirming that healing from trauma is well captured within scenario 1 of the GEM. And as you saw before, there are other differences. So we kind of think of that one now as a healing scenario. And just thinking about what other things are we doing. There's lots of stuff going on in this space. As 2017 citations of the validation paper have been more than the 6 years before, with more and more people writing to me and asking about the GEM, etc. So it's made its way to Canada. It's in a diabetes randomized control trial, including psychosocial support. It's being used in Kenya with women in a community development program, and all sorts of places. So in terms of alcohol and drug, and particularly my PhD student, Sarah Gaskin, looking at asking questions about what are the most urgent areas of empowerment needed in terms of someone in a situation entering service, any differences they might be carrying if their backpack has extra things in it like comorbidity, and what are their changes over time, and what can actually predict program completion that might be boosted up. And also a group from Dubbo actually developed a gem for kids, a junior gem they call it. It's quite lovely, and I'm really excited to see what they're doing with it as they develop that through. But just one other thing about the gem is that I think is really critical. So some people say, oh my gosh, I asked a question and I got all this. People wanted to talk about these things as you're going through the measure. And where that might actually be challenging in terms of its delivery, if you can hold off people from having that conversation as you're doing the measure, you can set it aside, and the next time you meet, start to work through. Because if these are triggering things that are really important to the person, which I gather, if you have a question that actually triggers a whole lot of need to talk about something, then utilize that. It can be used to actually then unpack what things are most challenging for the person. Okay, is that clear? Okay. Because it shouldn't be seen, just remember one of the things we try to do is to make this part of the healing and empowerment process. Not to put someone back because they're on the scoring lowest of something or other, but actually to be part of the conversation that you might pick up after the measurement, and then measure change at future time points. So I've had lots of people saying, you know, it actually opened up things that I would never have thought about, like identity, for example, or really struggling from that past pain. Okay, so what I'd like to do as the last thing is just to let you know and acknowledge the many, many services, programs, people that have been involved, the funding agencies, particularly the CRC for Aboriginal Health, as well as NHMRC, Queensland Health, Australian Health Ministers, FACSIA, that have actually contributed to our understandings of what's going on, and also towards the measurement of empowering change. Look, I know some of you have heard this before. This is a second time, or some of you might be going, oh, that's interesting, what next? Because I think the thing about this is to, if you think about what next, I've been at QUT now for a year and a half, and I've got my feet firmly planted. I've got my workload under control. So if there are people who are interested in looking at potential, well, wanting any help or guidance, or wanting to review, have any questions, what is it like to actually embed this in our services, etc. I know there's experience in Brisbane here, which is a real exciting thing. So please don't hesitate to contact me or Insight, but also maybe think about research projects. So in terms of family well-being, I think it would be amazing to trial the program within a service, or to trial it with service providers and then find out, reflect changes that might be inspired through the program in practice, or all sorts of things I think that are possible, and through research projects where we do actually gain learnings to share with others. I think there's so much potential here for that to happen, especially with a wonderful crew here and online that are plugged into aspects of empowerment. It's a really different way, I think, of thinking about recovery. It has synergies, but there are also some real enrichments, I think, when you think about this from an empowerment lens.